Well, this year for Epiphany, we're considering the question whether Jesus was truly human or not. And what we've been discovering the last couple weeks is that Jesus was and is shockingly human. We've opened up a can of worms the last few weeks, haven't we? I mean, we first with, you thought it was bad when I broke the news to you on Circumcision Sunday that Jesus has a penis. And yet, last week we discovered that, as if that isn't bad enough, Jesus not only has a physiology, he has a psychology, a truly human psychology. He suffered when he was tempted, as Hebrews tells us. He wrestled with his identity and discovering who he was and what he'd come to do. He had to learn to trust God for life and for dying and for being raised. That's our story, a truly human Jesus. Like us in every way, save for sin. But here's the trouble. Somewhere deep inside of us, we don't want to believe Jesus had a real body, that he was really human. We want to think Jesus was superhuman. And we said last week, we've got these ideas that maybe he was a fake human or a talking baby. We sort of imagined that Jesus was pretending to be human. He was just sort of levitating through life, emotionless. It's just this serenity, like he wasn't really impacted by life. We imagine Jesus like a hero in a movie, who all the hard stuff or the unseemly stuff is just edited out, and all the ordinariness of life is gone, and it's just all flowing along perfectly to a soundtrack. When we fail to recognize that Jesus is human, however, when we fail to recognize his very human origins, this story simply ceases to be good news. It's not good news anymore. And it's for that reason that the church developed this tool that we've been using this season called the lectionary. These assigned scriptures for every Sunday of the year and special ones for holidays. Because over the centuries, wise church leaders have recognized that without the full Jewish story of the Bible, Christianity easily gets twisted into a totally different type of story. A story that will serve all kinds of ends, all kinds of agendas. And I know it's hard to believe, but there have been eras in Christian history where Christians have so lost touch with the story that they find themselves playing for the wrong team. They find themselves scoring big points in the wrong goal. And without a human, truly human, Jewish, male Jesus, as he was in history, we can rationalize just about any story we want to tell about Jesus. We can even start to make Jesus like our mascot. And, that can make for some pretty bad art, amongst other things. During Epiphany, the lectionary tries to sort us out on this and introduce us to the real, historical, human Jesus by taking a story from the Gospels each week and then pairing it with the backstory from the Old Testament. And today, Margaret read our backstory that's appointed for today, 1 Samuel 3. And it's a story of a young prophet, Samuel, who in a time we find in the beginning of 1 Samuel is a time that the word of the Lord was rare, a time when Israel had forgotten who they were. And Samuel was an unlikely hero. He's a boy who grew up without really a father in his life, and a boy dropped off at the temple to be raised by an old priest with wicked sons. It's sort of a Cinderella story. Samuel's dedicated to service of God before birth, and so he's destined to do great things, so his mother thought. But he was born to a disgraced woman who longed for things to be made right in her life and in Israel, and so she just cries out. Hannah, his mother, cries out in prayer, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor." See, she thought Samuel was destined to be a boy who would call out religious corruption in Israel. She hoped he would be a boy who could bend the wayward path of Israel back toward God. And indeed, Samuel becomes a kingmaker. He establishes Israel as a kingdom under a king. First anointing Saul and then raising up David. Does that remind you of anyone? The boy Samuel? That upbringing? Because over 1,000 years later, another boy with a disgraced mother, a mother who cried out to the Lord that things would be made right in the world and the rulers would be torn down and the poor lifted up. 1,000 years later, another boy would come, announcing a new kingdom coming to Israel. But you see, in the backstory the backstory of the New Testament in Samuel, we find that before Samuel could do any of those things, he was just a boy learning to listen to God, learning to say, "Lord, here am I. Lord, speak, your servant is listening." He was a boy learning to walk the straight path, a boy learning obedience by what he suffered, a boy who would grow into a man who could wield incredible power faithfully. He would grow into a man that would really straighten out the whole path of the nation of Israel. But before he could do any of that, he had to pass this personal test. He had to learn when fears and sorrows and temptations came to just simply say to God, "Here am I. Speak. Your servant is listening." Now, why is that such a big deal? Why is that such a big deal? We'd actually see this comparison drawn from Old Testament to New. It's a big deal because ever since the beginning, God has been calling out to wayward humanity, off-course humanity. Where are you? Where have you gone? I mean, that's the question for Adam and Eve. Where are you? And God calls out, throughout Israel's history, God calls out to a wandering, hopelessly off-course world. He says, "Where are you? Where are you?" Because all the way back at the beginning of humanity, humanity went off course, hiding from God, running from the presence of God, failing to say, "Lord, here am I." Now, what have you said to God's call? How have you answered God's invitation to participate in new life, in the recreation of all things, the new world? I mean, the basic problem of humanity, according to the Old Testament, is a failure to say, "Here am I. Speak, Lord. Your servant is listening." To say, "Lord, here am I," and to get off the path of destruction, to take the narrow road that few have chosen. And throughout the Old Testament, many of the great heroes of faith said the same words as Samuel. "Here am I." Abraham declared, Jacob declared, Moses, David, Isaiah, "Here am I." And yet the conclusion by the time of Isaiah, the conclusion is, Isaiah tells us, "We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way. No one says, 'Here am I.' No one says, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" That's the backstory that the lectionary brings us today. That's the backstory. And only once we get the predicament, only once we understand the trouble we're in, can we really understand the solution that Jesus brings. So if we turn to the gospel lectionary passage today, it's John chapter 1. John 1, starting at verse 43. And on the face, this passage would seem to have really nothing to do with Samuel. If you've been following the lectionary with us, there's some of them are a head scratcher. You think, well, how did these passages get paired together? And yet the more you just ruminate on them and contemplate them, you realize there's connections here that I never saw before. So John 1:43 says, "The next day Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, 'Follow me.' Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. It says Philip found Nathanael and told him, 'We've found Moses, the one written about in the law, about whom the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph.' Nazareth? Can anything good come from there?" Nathanael asked. "Come and see," said Philip. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, "I saw you while you were still sitting under the fig tree before Philip called you." Then Nathanael declared, oddly, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And Jesus said, "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree. You'll see greater things than that." He then added, "Very truly will I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." And you know, what's really shocking about this story, first chapter of John, first days of Jesus' ministry, what's really shocking is that Jesus is a nobody here. He's still a nobody. He's from good-for-nothing Nazareth, as Nathanael's quick to point out. He's destined to cause the rising and the falling of many in Israel, but he's got a problem. He's a nobody. So how does somebody from a poor village, an out-of-the-way place, a poor family, no connections, no ins with important people, no publishing deal, no Twitter following, how does someone like that get started changing the world or impacting anything? I mean, do you fake it till you make it? Do you dream big and talk bigger? Is that what Jesus is doing here? I mean, think about what Jesus is doing in this passage. He's telling people with busy jobs and families to quit their jobs so they can start carrying around his luggage, essentially. I mean, he's talking like following him is the opportunity of a lifetime, and anyone would want to join him. I mean, he's telling people he's the Son of Man, which doesn't mean that he's human. I mean, it's this obscure little reference from the prophet Daniel who says, "I saw one coming like a son of man riding on the clouds." And that Son of Man was welcomed into the very presence of God, not just to bow down, but to be given glory and honor so that the whole world would bow down to him. Jesus says, I'm not just a Son of Man. I'm the Son of Man. I mean, Jesus is just, he's almost getting carried away here for a nobody. I mean, he's saying, I'm the man. You're about to see God work some miracles up in here. Just watch these hands. Angels up and down and angels all around, everywhere. There's going to be so many angels, you're going to be sick of all the angels. I mean, can you imagine the arrogance and what kind of brash maniac would it take to start talking that way? I mean, and before you answer, well, he's God in the flesh, remember that he's also a real man. He's still wrestling with who he is. He still wonders. He still has a need to belong and to be wanted, to be loved, to be accepted. Those things are in him. He's human. So how do we know that this Jesus that John presents doesn't have just a hopelessly inflated ego, like an ego problem? And the only way we can really see it is if we accept that Jesus is really human. Because when people start taking jabs at him here, isn't he from Nazareth? Psh, he's carpenter's son. You hear about his mother? When people mock him, Jesus doesn't respond like an insecure egomaniac with an honor to defend. I mean, which is to say, he doesn't respond like a normal man. I mean, that may not seem like a big deal to you, but this is exactly the point in which any normal, self-respecting man is going to start throwing around one-liners and jabs about who has the biggest whatever. Oh, yeah? I'm from Nazareth? Well, your mom's from Nazareth. I mean, you kind of expect here, when he sees Nathanael walking toward them, that it's going to just turn all West Side Story and like knife fights and dance battles. But it doesn't. Instead, Jesus just responds with total magnanimity and just grace and total sincerity. Nathanael, finally an Israelite in whom there's no deceit. And we know that it's not sarcasm, because Nathanael just stops dead in his tracks. I mean, he how do you know me? Well, I saw you under the fig tree. And Nathanael, he's all like, you must be the Son of God. You must be the King of Israel. And we don't really understand what was going on in this fig tree reference, but somehow Jesus is able to reach to this cynical man. And by the end, he says, you believe in me now? Well, you're going to see bigger things than this. I mean, what I think we're seeing in John, if we accept that Jesus is truly human, we're seeing here in John is just from day one in his ministry, Jesus has overcome the ego demon. He that dark part of every human psyche that needs constant approval and constant affirmation, ego, a demon that's every true human wrestles with. And what we're going to discover in John's book is that Jesus wasn't just truly human, he was newly human. There was something different about him. I mean, he doesn't have to argue about who the real man is, because he is the real man. He's the first of a new breed, a new humanity. He came to show us a new way to be human, we'll find as the story goes on. In fact, the only true way to be human, which is great news, isn't it? But it's also a little frightening news. If Jesus is truly human, it's a little scary. Because if Jesus was truly human, and yet after this baptism encounter with God, somehow becomes newly human, it means you and I, we've got some explaining to do, don't we? I mean, when we say things, I can't help myself. I'm just human. I mean, it's human nature. What do I do? I mean, we're Christians, but we keep wallowing in our sin, don't we? We choosing sin, like dogs to their vomit, as Proverbs says. I mean, like we can't do any better than this. Like this is just the way the world works. And when we start to think that way about our own humanity, well, we have to put Jesus in a different category. His way isn't realistic for me. Jesus doesn't live in the real world like me. He doesn't put his pants on one leg at a time, or his robe, or however he did it. Or someone told me a couple weeks ago, after our talk about Jesus' manhood, they said, well, Jesus, he didn't have to contend with, modern hemlines and short skirts and that sort of thing. You see, some of us were raised with a theology that conspires with us to disregard Jesus' humanity. I mean, we have a theology that conspires with us to disregard Jesus' teaching and go our own way, continue on this wayward path away from God. Some of us were raised with a theology that just conspires with us. And here's how it usually goes. Jesus died for your sins, so you can escape to heaven when you die. He's forgiven your sins. Good news. And if you're grateful, well, you'll try to knock it off with all that sinning, of course. But if you can't, or maybe, you simply won't, no matter, he paid God off a long time ago. So what's the problem with that theology? The problem is it's true, but it's not true enough. It's not true enough. It only considers the sacrificial death of Jesus. It doesn't know what to do with his life. And it enables us to go on believing that our best hope in life is to die and go somewhere else, to escape our humanity. It's just Christian enough to be convincing, and yet it's not true enough, because the story, the life story of Jesus and the backstory of his family will not let us go there. Jesus' truly newly human life announces that God isn't just forgiving sin. He's ending it. He's finishing it. And the story of the Bible is not one of God abandoning his world to sin, abandoning flesh and blood, forgiving the few that will trust him so he can whisk them away to another place. The story of the Bible is not just about how God forgives sin, but how God ends sin by carrying it upon his shoulders, not just at his death, but every day of his human life. You see, this story goes all the way back to the beginning, to Genesis, where we're told that humanity goes way off course. Humanity, in doing so, becomes less than human, subhuman, and begins to act in ways towards each other that are dehumanizing, less than fully human. And the question the Old Testament leaves us with is, how can humanity be brought back on course? I mean, heck, how can even one nation, Israel, be brought back on course? And that's just the point in the story where John the Baptist comes in like a crazy man, a crazy cousin out in the desert. We saw a couple weeks ago, eating bugs and freaking people out. And he says, I am the voice that Isaiah heard about. I am the voice of one calling in the wilderness, make straight the way for the Lord. He said, there's one coming after me, just like Isaiah prophesied. And I see every valley is going to be raised up, and every mountain and hill made low, and the crooked way, it's going to at last be made straight, and the rough places plain, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh will see it together. See, do you see it now? And Jesus is ending sin by blazing a new path right through the wasteland of human history. He's changing the landscape. He intends to make everything new. He's revealing what God's glory really looks like, what God himself looks like. He's not just forgiving sin, he's remaking everything. So during the coming weeks of Epiphany, we're going to see a side of Jesus that you may never have seen before. A Jesus who didn't just wrestle with temptations to ego and temptations towards shame and anxiety and seeking fame and seeking power. We're going to see a Jesus who didn't just wrestle with that when he was out in the actual desert. We're going to see a Jesus who wrestled with that every day of his truly human life. And last week, and this raises conflict in our mind. Like every day of his life, Jesus was like, this was voices in his mind, tempting and pulling him. I mean, that last week somebody asked me afterwards, they said, how come you didn't, you talk so much about Jesus' humanity, how come you never said that he didn't sin? And I suppose I just figured that you guys already knew that bit. But here's the real reason. There's a world of difference between saying that Jesus did not sin and Jesus could not sin. If Jesus could not sin, if he simply couldn't, like it's theoretically impossible, well, there's really no hope for you or I. No hope that you or I can ever be fully human in a body, without sin. No hope that this physical world can ever be made better than it is. I mean, if Jesus just could not sin, if he was faking it in his humanity, then the best hope we have is rapture. The best hope we have is get me out of this body. I mean, how am I ever going to get life right if I've still got these hormones and these sexual organs to contend with? How am I ever going to trust God and live in perfect surrendering obedience if I've still got these wandering eyes and this restless heart and this sad, out-of-shape figure and this psychology? I mean, if Jesus could not sin, well, there's just no good news there for our humanity. But if he simply didn't sin, if he chose not to, if he lived every day of his life battling sin, and like Samuel, and even more than Samuel, said, Lord, here am I. Speak. Your servant is listening. Well, that changes the whole story. That changes everything. I mean, if someone like that, who went their whole life able to sin, tempted by it, seriously tempted by it, instead chose not to, but to offer himself perfectly to God. Well, if that sort of person said, come follow me, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Well, you just might decide to trust him for once. You know that he knows more than just about how to die well. A few weeks ago, I showed you a clip of Dr. Martin Luther King and preaching that same passage out of Isaiah that John the Baptist preached. Preaching it from the steps of the Lincoln Monument. I have a dream that every valley shall be raised up and every mountain made low and the crooked way made straight, and the glory of God will be revealed, and all God's children will see it together. And the enduring legacy of Martin Luther King is not that he won the battle or a battle for civil rights. It's how he won. It's how he won. And you may know the story. December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested. And she wasn't a hero. She was just a lawbreaker. That was the 1960s. Segregation in the Deep South in Alabama. Blacks and whites prohibited from living in the same neighborhood, sending their kids to the same school, going to church together. Separate drinking fountains, separate restaurants, separate taxi cabs, separate ambulances, and even separate cemeteries, separate parks, separate seating sections. And in the city of Montgomery, there was not a single black person that sat on any municipal board or commission, though the city was 40% African American. Montgomery, you could say, was sort of a wasteland of human history. And yet there was a young preacher there, a newly appointed pastor in town, who saw a way through the wasteland. It was Martin Luther King. He was just a young, newly appointed pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and he led the way in organizing the Montgomery bus boycott. And it didn't go well. It didn't go quickly. And the Montgomery city officials, including the mayor, ordered police officers to disperse African Americans who waited on street corners for cabs. Police officers tailgated people of color around town and arrested them on all sorts of trumped-up charges. African Americans were issued citations for, such grievous things as walking on lawns and talking loud and congregating in white areas. There were numerous threats that year on Dr. King's life, and that was the year his house was bombed. And it was only after 382 days walking the wilderness of that wasteland that the Montgomery Bus Company finally conceded defeat, and only after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against segregated seating on their buses. The great legacy here is not how an oppressed people won the battle or a battle against city officials with all their guns and dogs and bombs and fire hoses and money. The enduring legacy is how that battle was won and what they did once they won. After more than a year of standing nonviolently against harassment and violence by people sworn to protect, officials elected for the people, Dr. King just refused to break out the champagne or, to celebrate with some kind of triumphalist statement about the downfall of his enemies and how they're getting what's coming to him. He refused to do it. And here's what he said in speech that day. He said, it's true. It's true that we struggle for freedom in America. And in this struggle, we're going to have to boycott sometimes. But we remember that as we boycott, the boycott's not an end within itself. The end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. So don't be smug. Don't rub it in anyone's face. Don't do a victory lap. Commit yourself to reconciliation with a passion at least equal to your commitment to desegregation. So when you sit down on a bus, don't be smug. Whether you're sitting next to somebody that's white or black, ask, may I? Pardon me. Because our goal isn't to win, he said. Our goal is to see a miracle in the hearts of men, to transform enemies into friends, to see the glory of God revealed. And that wasn't political correctness. That wasn't just clever strategy. This was a man that saw a way through the wasteland. And only one, a man willing to walk the straight path through that wasteland. Only that sort of man is worth following. Now, of course, we follow a man who did it more perfectly than Samuel. Any of the Old Testament heroes did it more perfectly than Martin Luther King. Did it more perfectly than any of us. We follow a man, a truly human man, that's blazing a new path right through this wasteland. And he does it in perfect integrity, offering himself to the Lord. Here am I. Speak, your servant is listening. And so when a man like that comes and says, follow me, I'm the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life, you might just want to consider trusting him. I mean, trusting him not just for dying, but for living. Now, trusting him that his plan for enemies is better than your plan for enemies. You're trusting him that those who show mercy to strangers will themselves be shown mercy by God. To trust him that those that are first really will be last, and the last made first. To trust him that if you say, God, here am I, you will not ever come to regret it. To trust a man like that if you say to God, speak, your servant is listening. Not because you're his slave, but because he's already said, you are my son, you are my daughter, in you I'm well pleased. To trust that you can say yes to a God like that. To trust that when Jesus comes to your door, as we read in Revelation, when Jesus comes to your door and he says, here am I stand at the door and knock. Well, you really want to open that door. Do you trust him that way? Because Jesus is ending all sin by blazing a path right through the wasteland of human history. And his is a way that truly leads to life and life everlasting. And it doesn't begin when we die. And that is very good news, church. So let's stand. Welcome Jesus into our presence by the Spirit. He's here among us by his Spirit. Somehow the risen, ascended Jesus, who still has a body, is made present to us by the Spirit. Let's welcome him now and worship.